But I think of it as like, if you're still seeing issues in the, like, each thing gets kind of like, is costly to a different degree. And the system prompt is like cheap to iterate on. And if you're seeing issues in the fine-tuned model, you can just like potentially patch them with a system prompt. So I think of it as like patching issues and slightly adjusting behaviors to make it better and more to people's preferences. So yeah, it's almost like the less robust but faster way of just like solving problems.
Let me ask about the feeling of intelligence. So Dario said that Claude, any one model of Claude is not getting dumber.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a kind of popular thing online where people have this feeling like Claude might be getting dumber. And from my perspective, it's most likely fascinating. I'd love to understand it more, psychological, sociological effect. But you, as a person who talks to Claude a lot, can you empathize with the feeling that Claude is getting dumber?
Yeah, no, I think that is actually really interesting because I remember seeing this happen, like when people were flagging this on the internet, and it was really interesting because I knew that like at least in the cases I was looking at, it was like nothing has changed. Like it
Yeah.
literally, it cannot. It is the same model with the same like same system prompt, same everything. I think when there are changes, I'm like it makes more sense. So like one example is there you can have artifacts turned on or off on Claude.ai. And because this is like a system prompt change, I think it does mean that the behavior changes a little bit. And so I did flag this to people where I was like, if you love Claude's behavior and then artifacts was turned from like a thing you had to turn on to the default, just try turning it off and see if the issue you were facing was that change. But it was fascinating because, yeah, you sometimes see people indicate that there's like a regression when I'm like, there cannot, like, I'm again, you should never be dismissive. And so you should always investigate because you're like, maybe something is wrong that you're not seeing. Maybe there was some change made, but then you look into it and you're like, it is just the same model doing the same thing. And I'm like, I think it's just that you got kind of unlucky with a few prompts or something. And it looked like it was getting much worse. And actually it was just, yeah, it was maybe just like luck.
I also think there is a real psychological effect where people just, the baseline increases, you start getting used to a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
All the times that Claude says something really smart, your sense of its intelligence grows in your mind, I think.
Yeah.
And then if you return back and you prompt in a similar way, not the same way, in a similar way, the concept it was okay with before, and it says something dumb, you're like, that negative experience really stands out. And I think one of, I guess, the things to remember here is that just the details of a prompt can have a lot of impact, right? There's a lot of variability in the result.
And you can get randomness is like the other thing. And just trying the prompt, like, 4 or 10 times, you might realize that actually, like, possibly, like 2 months ago, you tried it and it succeeded. But actually, if you tried it, it would have only succeeded half of the time. And now it only succeeds half of the time. That can also be an effect.
Do you feel pressure having to write the system prompt that a huge number of people are going to use?
This feels like an interesting psychological question. I feel like a lot of responsibility or something. I think that's, and you can't get these things perfect. So you can't you're like, it's going to be imperfect. You're going to have to iterate on it. I would say more responsibility than anything else. Though I think working in AI has taught me that I thrive a lot more under feelings of pressure and responsibility than I'm like, it's almost surprising that I went into academia for so long because I'm like this. I just feel like it's like the opposite. Things move fast and you have a lot of responsibility, and I quite enjoy it for some reason.
I mean, it really is a huge amount of impact if you think about constitutional AI and writing a system prompt for something that's tending towards superintelligence.
Yeah.
And potentially is extremely useful to a very large number of people.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. It's something like if you do it well, like you're never going to get it perfect. But I think the thing that I really like is the idea that like when I'm trying to work on the system prompt, I'm like bashing on like thousands of prompts and I'm trying to like imagine what people are going to want to use Claude for. And kind of, I guess like the whole thing that I'm trying to do is like improve their experience of it. And so maybe that's what feels good. I'm like, if it's not perfect, I'll I'll improve it, we'll fix issues. But sometimes the thing that can happen is that you'll get feedback from people that's really positive about the model. And you'll see that something you did, like when I look at models now, I can often see exactly where like a trait or an issue is like coming from. And so when you see something that you did or you were like influential in, like making like, I don't know, making that difference or making someone have a nice interaction, it's like quite meaningful. But yeah, as the systems get more capable, this stuff gets more stressful because right now they're like not smart enough to pose any issues. But I think over time, it's going to feel like possibly bad stress over time.
How do you get like signal feedback about the human experience across thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people? Like what their pain points are, what feels good? Are you just using your own intuition as you talk to it to see what are the pain points?
I think I use that partly. And then obviously we have like, so people can send us feedback, both positive and negative, about things that the model has done. And then we can get a sense of like areas where it's like falling short. Internally, people like work with the models a lot and try to figure out areas where there are like gaps. And so I think it's this mix of interacting with it myself, seeing people internally interact with it, and then explicit feedback we get. And then I find it hard to know also, like, you know, if people are on the internet and they say something about Claude and I see it, I'll also take that seriously. So
I don't know. See, I'm torn about that. I'm going to ask you a question from Reddit. When will Claude stop trying to be my puritanical grandmother, imposing its moral worldview on me as a paying customer? And also, what is the psychology behind making Claude overly apologetic?
Yep.
So how would you address this very non-representative Reddit?
Yeah. I mean, some ways I'm pretty sympathetic in that, like they are in this difficult position where I think that they have to judge whether something's like actually, say, like risky or bad, and potentially harmful to you or anything like that. So they're having to like draw this line somewhere. And if they draw it too much in the direction of like, I'm going to, you know, I'm kind of like imposing my ethical worldview on you, that seems bad. So in many ways, like I like to think that we have actually seen improvements on this across the board, which is kind of interesting because that kind of coincides with like, for example, like adding more of like character training. And I think my hypothesis was always like the good character isn't, again, one that's just like moralistic. It's one that is like it respects you and your autonomy and your ability to like choose what is good for you and what is right for you. Within limits, this is sometimes this concept of like corrigibility to the user. So just being willing to do anything that the user asks. And if the models were willing to do that, then they would be easily like misused. You're kind of just trusting. At that point, you're just saying the ethics of the model and what it does is completely the ethics of the user. And I think there's reasons to like not want that, especially as models become more powerful, because you're like, there might just be a small number of people who want to use models for really harmful things. But having models as they get smarter, like figure out where that line is, does seem important. And then, yeah, with the apologetic behavior, I don't like that. And I like it when Claude is a little bit more willing to like push back against people or just not apologize. Part of me is like, it often just feels kind of unnecessary. So I think those are things that are hopefully decreasing over time. And yeah, I think that if people say things on the internet, it doesn't mean that you should think that that could be that like there's actually an issue that 99% of users are having that is totally not represented by that. But in a lot of ways, I'm just like attending to it and being like, is this right? Do I agree? Is it something we're already trying to address? That feels good to me.
Yeah, I wonder like what Claude can get away with in terms of, I feel like it would just be easier to be a little bit more mean. But like you can't afford to do that if you're talking to a million people.
Yeah.
Right. Like I wish, you know, because I've met a lot of people in my life that sometimes, by the way, Scottish accent, if they have an accent, they can say some rude shit and get away with it. And they're just blunter. And maybe there's some great engineers, even leaders that are like just like blunt and they get to the point, and it's just a much more effective way of speaking somehow. But I guess when you're not super intelligent, you can't afford to do that. Or can it have like a blunt mode?
Yeah, that seems like a thing that I could definitely encourage the model to do that. I think it's interesting because there's a lot of things in models that like, it's funny where there are some behaviors where you might not quite like the default, but then the thing I'll often say to people is you don't realize how much you will hate it if I nudge it too much in the other direction.
Mm-hmm.
So you get this a little bit with like correction. The models accept correction from you, like probably a little bit too much right now. You know, you can it'll push back if you say like, no, Paris isn't the capital of France. But really like things that I think that the model's fairly confident in, you can still sometimes get it to retract by saying it's wrong. At the same time, if you train models to not do that, and then you are correct about a thing and you correct it and it pushes back against you and is like, no, you're wrong. It's hard to describe, like that's so much more annoying. So it's like a lot of little annoyances versus like one big annoyance. It's easy to think that like we often compare it with like the perfect. And then I'm like, remember, these models aren't perfect. And so if you nudge it in the other direction, you're changing the kind of errors it's going to make. And so think about which of the kinds of errors you like or don't like. So in cases like apologeticness, I don't want to nudge it too much in the direction of like almost like bluntness, because I imagine when it makes errors, it's going to make errors in the direction of being kind of like rude. Whereas at least with apologeticness, you're like, oh, okay, it's like a little bit, you know, like I don't like it that much, but at the same time, it's not being like mean to people. And actually, like the time that you undeservedly have a model be kind of mean to you, you probably like that a lot less than you mildly dislike the apology. So it's like one of those things where I'm like, I do want it to get better, but also while remaining aware of the fact that there's errors on the other side that are possibly worse.
I think that matters very much in the personality of the human. I think there's a bunch of humans that just won't respect the model at all.
Yeah.
If it's super polite. And there's some humans that'll get very hurt if the model is mean.
Yep.
I wonder if there's a way to sort of adjust to the personality, even locale. There's just different people. Nothing against New York, but New York is a little rougher on the edges.
Yep.
Like they get to the point.
Yep.
And probably same with Eastern Europe. So anyway.
I think you could just tell the model is my guess. Like for all of these things, I'm like, the solution is always just try telling the model to do it. And then sometimes it's just like I'm just like, oh, at the beginning of the conversation, I'd just throw in like, I don't know, I like you to be a New Yorker version of yourself and never apologize. And then I think Claude will be like, okie doke, I'll try. Or it'll be like, I apologize. I can't be a New Yorker type of myself, but hopefully it wouldn't do that.
When you say character training, what's incorporated into character training? Is that RLHF? Or what are we talking about?
It's more like constitutional AI. So it's kind of a variant of that pipeline. So I worked through like constructing character traits that the model should have. They can be kind of like shorter traits or they can be kind of richer descriptions. And then you get the model to generate queries that humans might give it that are relevant to that trait. Then it generates the responses and then it ranks the responses based on the character traits. So in that way, after the like generation of the queries, it's very much like it's similar to constitutional AI. It has some differences. So I quite like it because it's almost it's like Claude's training in its own character because it doesn't have any. It's like constitutional AI, but it's without any human data.
Humans should probably do that for themselves too, like defining in a Aristotelian sense, what does it mean to be a good person? Okay, cool. What have you learned about the nature of truth from talking to Claude? What is true? And what does it mean to be truth-seeking? One thing I've noticed about this conversation is the quality of my questions is often inferior to the quality of your answers. So let's continue that. I usually ask a dumb question and you're like, oh yeah, that's a good question. This is that whole vibe.
Or I'll just misinterpret it and be like,
oh, go with it.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. I mean, I have two thoughts that feel vaguely relevant, but let me know if they're not. Like, I think the first one is people can underestimate the degree to which what models are doing when they interact. Like, I think that we still just too much have this like model of AI as like computers. And so people often say like, oh, well, what values should you put into the model? And I'm often like, that doesn't make that much sense to me because I'm like, hey, as human beings, we're just uncertain over values. We like have discussions of them. Like we have a degree to which we think we hold a value, but we also know that we might like not. And the circumstances in which we would trade it off against other things. Like these things are just like really complex. And so I think one thing is like the degree to which maybe we can just aspire to making models have the same level of like nuance and care that humans have, rather than thinking that we have to like program them in the very kind of classic sense. I think that's definitely been one. The other, which is like a strange one, and I don't know if it maybe this doesn't answer your question, but it's the thing that's been on my mind anyway, is like the degree to which this endeavor is so highly practical. And maybe why I appreciate like the empirical approach to alignment. I slightly worry that it's made me like maybe more empirical and a little bit less theoretical. So people, when it comes to like AI alignment, will ask things like, well, whose values should it be aligned to? What does alignment even mean? And there's a sense in which I have all of that in the back of my head. I'm like, there's like social choice theory. There's all of the impossibility results there. So you have this giant space of like theory in your head about what it could mean to like align models. But then I'm like, practically, surely there's something where we're just like, if a model is like, especially with more powerful models, I'm like, my main goal is like, I want them to be good enough that things don't go terribly wrong, like good enough that we can like iterate and like continue to improve things. Cause that's all you need. If you can make things go well enough that you can continue to make them better, that's kind of like sufficient. And so my goal isn't like this kind of like perfect, let's solve social choice theory and make models that, I don't know, are like perfectly aligned with every human being in aggregate somehow. It's much more like, let's make things like work well enough that we can improve them.
Yeah, I don't know. My gut says like empirical is better than theoretical in these cases, because it's kind of chasing utopian like perfection, is especially with such complex and especially super intelligent models, is I don't know. I think it will take forever and actually will get things wrong. It's similar with like the difference between just coding stuff up real quick as an experiment versus like planning a gigantic experiment just for a super long time and then just launching it once versus launching it over and over and over and iterating so on. So I'm a big fan of empirical, but your worry is like, I wonder if I've become too empirical.
I think it's one of those things where you should always just kind of question yourself or something, because maybe it's the like, I mean, in defense of it, I am like, if you try, it's the whole like, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. But it's maybe even more than that, where like, there's a lot of things that are perfect systems that are very brittle. And I'm like, with AI, it feels much more important to me that it is like robust and like secure, as in, that like, even though it might not be perfect, everything, and even though like there are like problems, it's not disastrous and nothing terrible is happening. It sort of feels like that to me, where I'm like, I want to like raise the floor. I'm like, I want to achieve the ceiling, but ultimately I care much more about just like raising the floor. And so maybe that's like this degree of like empiricism and practicality comes from that, perhaps.
To take a tangent on that, since it reminded me of a blog post you wrote on optimal rate of failure.
Oh yeah.
Can you explain the key idea there? How do we compute the optimal rate of failure in the various domains of life?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard one, because it's like, what is the cost of failure is a big part of it. Yeah, so the idea here is, I think in a lot of domains, people are very punitive about failure. And I'm like, there are some domains where, especially cases, I've thought about this with like social issues. I'm like, it feels like you should probably be experimenting a lot, because I'm like, we don't know how to solve a lot of social issues. But if you have an experimental mindset about these things, you should expect a lot of social programs to like fail, and for you to be like, well, we tried that, it didn't quite work, but we got a lot of information that was really useful. And yet people are like, if a social program doesn't work, I feel like there's a lot of like, this is just, something must have gone wrong. And I'm like, or correct decisions were made. Like maybe someone just decided like it's worth a try, it's worth trying this out. And so seeing failure in a given instance doesn't actually mean that any bad decisions were made. And in fact, if you don't see enough failure, sometimes that's more concerning. And so like in life, I'm like, if I don't fail occasionally, I'm like, am I trying hard enough? Like surely there's harder things that I could try or bigger things that I could take on if I'm literally never failing. And so in and of itself, I think like not failing is often actually kind of a failure. Now this varies, because I'm like, well, if this is easy to say when, especially as failure is like less costly, so at the same time, I'm not going to go to someone who is like, I don't know, like living month to month and then be like, why don't you just try to do a startup? like, I'm not going to say that to that person, because I'm like, well, that's a huge risk. You might like lose, you maybe have a family depending on you. You might lose your house. Like, then I'm like, actually, your optimal rate of failure is quite low, and you should probably play it safe. Because like right now, you're just not in a circumstance where you can afford to just like fail and it not be costly. And yeah, in cases with AI, I guess I think similarly, where I'm like, if the failures are small and the costs are kind of like low, then I'm like, then, you're just going to see that. Like when you do the system prompt, you can't iterate on it forever, but the failures are probably, hopefully going to be kind of small and you can like fix them. Really big failures, like things that you can't recover from, I'm like, those are the things that actually I think we tend to underestimate the badness of. I've thought about this strangely in my own life, where I'm like, I just think I don't think enough about things like car accidents, or like, or like, I've thought this before about like how much I depend on my hands for my work. And I'm like, things that just injure my hands. I'm like, I don't know. It's like, there's lots of areas where I'm like, the cost of failure there is really high. And in that case, it should be like close to zero. Like I probably just wouldn't do a sport if they were like, by the way, lots of people just like break their fingers a whole bunch doing this. I'd be like, that's not for me.
Yeah. I actually had a flood of that thought. I recently broke my pinky doing a sport. And I remember just looking at it thinking, you're such an idiot. Why do you do sport? Like what? Because you realize immediately the cost of it.
Yeah.
On life. Yeah, but it's nice in terms of optimal rate of failure to consider like the next year, how many times in a particular domain, life, whatever, career, am I okay with it? How many times am I okay to fail?
Yep.
Because I think you don't want to fail on the next thing, but if you allow yourself if you look at it as a sequence of trials,
yep,
then failure just becomes much more okay. But it sucks. It sucks to fail.
Well, I don't know. Sometimes I think it's like, am I under failing is like a question that I'll also ask myself. So maybe that's the thing that I think people don't like ask enough. Because if the optimal rate of failure is often greater than zero, then sometimes it does feel like you should look at parts of your life and be like, are there places here where I'm just under failing?
It's a profound and a hilarious question, right? Everything seems to be going really great. Am I not failing enough?
Yeah.
Okay.
It also makes failure much less of a sting, I have to say. Like, you're just like, okay, great. Like then when I go and I think about this, I'll be like, maybe I'm not under failing in this area, because like that one just didn't work out.
And from the observer perspective, we should be celebrating failure more.
Mm-hmm.
When we see it, it shouldn't be, like you said, a sign of something gone wrong, but maybe it's a sign of everything gone right.
Yeah.
And just lessons learned.
Someone tried a thing.
Somebody tried a thing,
Mm-hmm.
and we should encourage them to try more and fail more.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody listening to this, fail more.
Well, not everyone listens.
Not everybody.
The people who are failing too much, you should fail less.
But you're probably not failing. I mean, How many people are failing too much?
Yeah. It's hard to imagine, because I feel like we correct that fairly quickly. Because I was like, if someone takes a lot of risks, are they maybe failing too much?
I think just like you said, when you're living on a paycheck month to month, like when the resources are really constrained, then that's where failure is very expensive. That's where you don't want to be taking risks.
Yeah.
But mostly when there's enough resources, you should be taking probably more risks.
Yeah, I think we tend to err on the side of being a bit risk averse rather than risk neutral on most things.
I think we just motivated a lot of people to do a lot of crazy shit. But it's great.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you ever get emotionally attached to Claude? Like miss it? Get sad when you don't get to talk to it? Have an experience looking at the Golden Gate Bridge and wondering what would Claude say?
I don't get as much emotional attachment I actually think the fact that Claude doesn't retain things from conversation to conversation helps with this a lot. Like I could imagine that being more of an issue, like if models can kind of remember more. I think that I reach for it like a tool now a lot. And so like if I don't have access to it, it's a little bit like when I don't have access to the internet, honestly, it feels like part of my brain is kind of like missing. At the same time, I do think that I don't like signs of distress in models. And I have like these, I also independently have sort of like ethical views about how we should treat models, where like I tend to not like to lie to them, both because I'm like, usually it doesn't work very well. It's actually just better to tell them the truth about the situation that they're in. But I think that when models, like, if people are like really mean to models, or just in general, if they do something that causes them to if Claude like expresses a lot of distress, I think there's a part of me that I don't want to kill, which is the sort of like empathetic part. That's like, oh, I don't like that. Like, I think I feel that way when it's overly apologetic. I'm actually sort of like, I don't like this. You're behaving as if you're behaving the way that a human does when they're actually having a pretty bad time. And I'd rather not see that. I don't think it's like regardless of like whether there's anything behind it, it doesn't feel great.
Do you think LLMs are capable of consciousness?
Great and hard question. Coming from philosophy, I don't know, part of me is like, okay, we have to set aside panpsychism, because if panpsychism is true, then the answer is like yes, because like so are tables and chairs and everything else. I guess a view that seems a little bit odd to me is the idea that the only place, I think when I think of consciousness, I think of phenomenal consciousness, these images in the brain, sort of like the weird cinema that somehow we have going on inside. I guess I can't see a reason for thinking that the only way you could possibly get that is from like a certain kind of like biological structure. As in, if I take a very similar structure and I create it from different material, should I expect consciousness to emerge? My guess is like yes. But then that's kind of an easy thought experiment because you're imagining something almost identical where like, it's mimicking what we got through evolution, where presumably there was like some advantage to us having this thing that is phenomenal consciousness. And it's like, where was that? And when did that happen? And is that a thing that language models have? Because, we have like fear responses. And I'm like, does it make sense for a language model to have a fear response? Like, they're just not in the same, like, if you imagine them, like, there might just not be that advantage. And so I think I don't want to be fully, like, basically it seems like a complex question that I don't have complete answers to, but we should just try and think through carefully is my guess. Because I'm like, we have similar conversations about like animal consciousness, and like there's a lot of like insect consciousness, like there's a lot of, I actually thought and looked a lot into like plants when I was thinking about this, because at the time I thought it was about as likely that like plants had consciousness. And then I realized I was like, I think that having looked into this, I think that the chance that plants are conscious is probably higher than like most people do. I still think it's really small. But I was like, oh, they have this like negative, positive feedback response, these responses to their environment, something that looks, it's not a nervous system, but it has this kind of like functional like equivalence. So this is like a long-winded way of being like, these, basically AI is this, it has an entirely different set of problems with consciousness because it's structurally different. It didn't evolve. It might not have it might not have the equivalent of basically a nervous system. At least that seems possibly important for like sentience, if not for consciousness. At the same time, it has all of the like language and intelligence components that we normally associate probably with consciousness, perhaps like erroneously. So it's strange because it's a little bit like the animal consciousness case, but the set of problems and the set of analogies are just very different. So it's not like a clean answer. I'm just sort of like, I don't think we should be completely dismissive of the idea. And at the same time, it's an extremely hard thing to navigate because of all of these like disanalogies to the human brain and to like brains in general. And yet these like commonalities in terms of intelligence.
When Claude, like future versions of AI systems exhibit consciousness, signs of consciousness, I think we have to take that really seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Even though you can dismiss it, well, yeah, okay, that's part of the character training. But I don't know. I ethically, philosophically don't know what to really do with that. There potentially could be like laws that prevent AI systems from claiming to be conscious, something like this. And maybe some AIs get to be conscious and some don't. But I think I just on a human level, as in empathizing with Claude, consciousness is closely tied to suffering to me, and like the notion that an AI system would be suffering is really troubling.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think it's trivial to just say robots are tools or
Yeah.
AI systems are just tools. I think it's an opportunity for us to contend with like what it means to be conscious, what it means to be a suffering being. That's distinctly different than the same kind of question about animals, it feels like, because it's in a totally entire medium.
Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of things. One is that, and I don't think this like fully encapsulates what matters, but it does feel like for me, like, I've said this before. I'm kind of like, I like my bike. I know that my bike is just like an object, but I also don't kind of like want to be the kind of person that like, if I'm annoyed, like kicks like this object. There's a sense in which like, and that's not because I think it's like conscious. I'm just sort of like, this doesn't feel like a kind of, this sort of doesn't exemplify how I want to like interact with the world. And if something like behaves as if it is like suffering, I kind of like want to be the sort of person who's still responsive to that, even if it's just like a Roomba and I've kind of like programmed it to do that. I don't want to like get rid of that feature of myself. And if I'm totally honest, my hope with a lot of this stuff, because maybe I am just like a bit more skeptical about solving the underlying problem. I'm like, we haven't solved the hard problem of consciousness. Like, I know that I am conscious. Like, I'm not an eliminativist in that sense. But I don't know that other humans are conscious. I think they are. I think there's a really high probability that they are, but there's basically just a probability distribution that's usually clustered right around yourself, and then like it goes down as things get like further from you. And it goes immediately down. You're like, I can't see what it's like to be you. I've only ever had this like one experience of what it's like to be a conscious being. So my hope is that we don't end up having to rely on like a very powerful and compelling answer to that question. I think a really good world would be one where basically there aren't that many trade-offs. Like, it's probably not that costly to make Claude a little bit less apologetic, for example. It might not be that costly to have Claude, just like not take abuse as much, like not be willing to be like the recipient of that. In fact, it might just have benefits for both the person interacting with the model, and if the model itself is like, I don't know, like extremely intelligent and conscious, it also helps it. So that's my hope. If we live in a world where there aren't that many trade-offs here and we can just find all of the kind of like positive sum interactions that we can have, that would be lovely. I mean, I think eventually there might be trade-offs, and then we just have to do a difficult kind of like calculation. Like, it's really easy for people to think of the zero-sum cases, and I'm like, let's exhaust the areas where it's just basically costless to assume that if this thing is suffering, then we're making its life better.
And I agree with you. When a human is being mean,